Welcome to COM 4740, Chapter 8, Understanding Cultural Transitions. In this chapter, we're going to examine how people move into and out of other cultures, especially geographic and national cultures. And in order to understand that movement, we need to define certain types of migrant groups. Now, when we talk about the word migrant, think of the root word migrate, or someone who moves. So migrants are those who move into a new cultural context. There are two types we're going to focus on: voluntary and involuntary migrants. Voluntary migrants are people like sojourners and immigrants. Sojourners are people who move into another cultural context for a limited amount of time. They go there on purpose and they then return to their home culture afterwards. So if you have ever gone on a vacation or studied abroad, you have been a sojourner because you've gone to a place or a different culture intending to spend a short amount of time there and to come back home. Immigrants are people who move into a new cultural context with the intention of staying there. So the difference between sojourners and immigrants is sojourners intend to return to their home culture, whereas immigrants intend to make a permanent home in the new culture. I've shown you a book cover here, a book by Craig Ferguson. You might know him as a late night comedian on TV, and he is originally from Scotland, and he wrote this very funny book, American on Purpose. What's the subtitle? The Improbable Adventures of an Unlikely Patriot. And it's a fascinating look at immigration because he talks about what his impressions of America were when he was a young child and how he developed a desire to relocate to America and what that process was like for him. So he serves as a good example of an immigrant. So sojourners and immigrants are the voluntary migrants. We also have involuntary migrants, people who leave their original culture or home culture against their will. And we would call these people refugees. Recall the words diaspora and enclaves that we talked about earlier in the course. Diaspora being a population of people or culture that gets scattered all over the world or all over a geographic region. And then enclaves are places where those people come together to live in little pockets where they can continue to practice their home culture. So these people are often refugees, people who are forced out of their homeland due to economic situations, due to civil war, due to other cataclysmic events like that, famine, for example. In the supplemental videos folder on e-learning, you'll find two videos about the Lost Boys. There's a part 1 and a part 2. Now, if you don't see those two videos on the menu, you might need to scroll down to the bottom of the screen and click on Load More, because they're like on a second page on the e-learning site. The Lost Boys were a group of Sudanese refugees who were forced out of their homeland due to civil war, and many of them were brought to the United States. So these videos show their experience in coming to the United States where they had never been before. They had no experience with a lot of modern technology and had to learn to cope in a very strange new land. And as we go through this chapter, the story of the Lost Boys is going to be a really useful reference for us, a really useful thing for us to reflect back on as we discuss different concepts. So I really encourage you to take a pause in this video and watch those videos about the Lost Boys. The migrant groups who come into a new host culture, develop some kind of a relationship to the host culture. So we have two cultures meeting together, and we want to examine whether or not the host culture is accepting of the migrant culture or not. And there are three particular migrant-host relationships that I would like to examine with you, which are assimilation, separation, and integration. And we'll examine these in more detail on the slides that follow. We should also consider a concept called hybridity. And a hybrid is a person who has experience or has roots in both of the cultures and has to navigate between them. We talked about this a little bit in the last chapter when we examined the idea of code switching. But a hybrid might be someone like a Chinese American whose parents are Chinese and the Chinese American person was born here and they know how to navigate both cultures, but at the same time they have to switch between them. That kind of a person would be a hybrid. So let's move on to examine these migrant-host relationships. The first of the three was assimilation, which is a word that you're probably familiar with, and we looked at assimilation in a prior chapter as well. In terms of migrant-host relationships, assimilation is what happens when the migrant gives up their own heritage and adopts the mainstream cultural identity. So if you've studied American history and you know about the early 20th century influx of immigrants from Europe and what the cultural standards were at that time, you might be aware that people coming here were expected to leave the old country behind. They were expected to assimilate into American culture, to dress like us, to talk like us, to learn English. And even within families, a lot of parents encourage their children to leave the old ways behind and to assimilate. Assimilation is one approach to integrating yourself with a new culture, but it is also fraught with difficulties such as losing your feeling of connection with your home culture and battling with power structures, which is why I've added, think of the power issues here. When we talked about code switching before, we talked about how it's important for the person in a position of lesser power to be able to interact within the power structure in order to be successful. And that's happening quite a bit here. If the host culture expects newcomers to assimilate, that is a power move, an exercise of power, because the host culture is not interested in what the migrant might have to contribute based in their home culture. The host culture is just interested in having the person assimilate, to, keep your head down, be quiet, work hard, and learn to live life our way. Another type of migrant-host relationship is separation. So the incoming migrant group might choose to live separately from the mainstream culture, and they might choose to do this, or they might be compelled by society to do this. So when we look at a group like the Amish, they have chosen to live separately from mainstream culture. So we have enclaves of Amish people that have voluntarily decided to live separately. Some migrant groups might also be compelled by society to live separately. They might be forced into particular neighborhoods or particular workplaces by the culture around them. Once again, think about the power issues here. In separation that is chosen, such as the Amish, that group is exercising their own power, and you might say taking back their power in choosing to live that way. But if you are forced into a certain segment of society because you are different, then we have a power issue going on. We have a refusal of assimilation or a denial of the opportunity to assimilate. And then the third type of migrant-host relationship I'd like to examine with you is called integration. And in integration, the host culture and the migrant culture will mix and interact, yet they will keep their own identities. So there is some mixing and interaction, some conversation, some societal and political interaction between the groups, yet the groups still are seen as separate and still see themselves as separate. So if you think of U.S. integration in the mid-20th century, you might see that white culture and black culture were beginning to mix and interact more than they had in the past, but there was still a strong sense of those individual racial cultures. So there really wasn't a blending. It was more of an allowing of interaction. And one example of this might be school busing. If you've ever studied about that in your history course, and of course I was born in the mid-20th century, so I remember when school busing was going on. Now, my school district didn't have it, but many did, where they would bus white kids from an all-white area to a traditionally black school and bus some black kids into the white school in an effort to integrate the school and to give those children a chance to interact with each other. But if you remember the contact hypothesis that we talked about before, you'll see that that doesn't always work if it isn't supported and facilitated by authority figures. So back then, as now, there was a lot of racial strife. And while they put these children together in schools, there wasn't a lot of facilitating of positive interaction, positive dialogue between them. So busing, was it a success or a failure? You would have to study it and come to your own conclusion about that. But that was an effort to integrate U.S. culture racially. So let's look at this idea of cultural hybridity. As I mentioned before, this is a person who kind of has a foot in both cultures and may sometimes assimilate and other times integrate based on the situation they are in. In the supplemental videos folder here on eLearning, there is a clip from the Joy Luck Club movie. And in this clip, which I would like you to watch as an illustration of hybridity, you will see a Chinese American named Waverly brings her American boyfriend home to have dinner with her Chinese parents. And so here we have Waverly, who is an adult woman who has grown up with Chinese parents, but she also works in the American mainstream culture and understands both cultures. She brings her American boyfriend home who does not understand Chinese culture, and you'll see in the clip she tried to give him some hints on how to behave, but when he comes into her family situation, he's a fish out of water. And you can see in the clip that Waverly understands both sides of this. She understands her parents' attitudes and her parents' judgment toward the boyfriend, but she also understands the boyfriend's awkwardness and how he doesn't know the correct ways to speak and behave in every situation. So she's in this middle place, this hybrid place, where she knows how to assimilate and she knows how to integrate, but the people around her do not have those skills. So please take a moment to watch that video clip. Now let's take a look at cultural adaptation, or the process people go through when they are adjusting to a new culture. So when you are that fish out of water, what are some different ways that you might adjust, or how can we predict whether you might be a good adjuster or a bad adjuster? So as we have always used in this course, we're going to take three approaches to this idea of cultural adaptation and look at the social science, interpretive, and critical approaches. So three different pairs of glasses we're going to put on to look at this idea of adjusting to a new culture. Let's begin with the social science approach. Now we know that the social science approach is a quantitative methods approach where we try to be predictive and prescriptive. So we try to say, if these conditions exist, this will be the outcome. So the social science approach to cultural adaptation focuses on characteristics of the person. For example, age, gender, their expectations of the experience, and sees these as influential or predictive of how well they will adapt. So, for example, the social science approach might suggest that young people are going to adapt more easily than older people. The approach might suggest that males would adapt more easily than females. It might suggest that those who have positive expectations of the experience are going to adapt more readily than those who have fears about the experience. So the social science approach is going to look at an individual and say, okay, what criteria do they meet? What boxes do they check? And if they check these particular boxes, I'm going to predict that they are going to adapt successfully. So you might have heard people say that little kids who move around a lot, kids whose parents are in the military, third culture kids, global nomads, adjust more easily than older people. You might have heard that. Or you might have heard that the younger you are, the more easily you learn new languages. Those kind of attitudes are characteristic of this social science approach. The idea that if a person meets particular criteria, they're more likely to be successful in adapting. The interpretive approach takes a more individualized look on things and suggests that cultural adaptation is a process that is experienced, that we can't always predict how it's going to work just based on characteristics of the person. So think of the Lost Boys and the videos that you watched earlier about the Lost Boys and how these young men were all enthusiastic about coming to the United States. They had a positive outlook on it. They were relatively young. They were bright. They had characteristics that you might think would make them adapt well, but they didn't all have the same experience when they got here, especially the young man who was a minister and the young man who wanted to be a doctor. They had very different outcomes when they came here that were not entirely dependent on themselves. They landed in different geographic places in the US. They had different support systems. Abraham, the minister, had a more extensive support system than did, I believe his name was Joseph, the young man who wanted to be a doctor. So there were all kinds of factors influencing how successful their adaptation was. An interesting element of the interpretive approach is the U-curve model and the W-curve model, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Let's start with the U-curve model. The U-curve model suggests that when you are adapting to a new culture, you go through these three phases of anticipation, culture shock, and then adjustment. So starting at the upper left-hand corner of the U, that's your anticipation. You're excited, you think good things are going to happen, you're willing to go to this new culture. Then you're going to experience some culture shock when you get there, and that's the bottom of the U. So there is a little bit of a letdown. Things are more difficult than you anticipated. Things are different than you anticipated, and you encounter a struggle there. But then you adjust to it. So that's the right hand part of the U. You go back up to the top right hand corner of the U. And the idea is once you have dealt with the culture shock and adjusted to it, you're back in a positive place. So think about how this might have worked in your own life, even coming to college, especially if you're a student who moved to Kalamazoo for this experience. When you were a high school student, you might have been very excited about going to college and had all these ideas about how wonderful it was going to be, the friends, the sports, the parties, all these things. But then when you got here, there was probably a period of culture shock. You had to adjust to a lot of new things. Maybe things weren't as positive as you had anticipated. But then you do reach a period of adjustment where you have come to terms with how things really are, and you're learning to enjoy being here, even though it isn't what you originally fantasized it might be. That explains the U-curve model. The W-curve model suggests that we go through this twice when we enter and leave a culture. So it's similar to the U-curve, but think of two U-curves put together. So, like the U-curve, you have anticipation, culture shock, and adjustment in the new culture. It's the first part of the W. But then you go home and you go through the whole process again. You have anticipation, culture shock, and adjustment once you go home. So it's like going through the U-curve twice, which gives us the W-curve. Let me give you an example. I have a former student who was very interested in Japanese culture. She was one of my best students in the intercultural course, and I was her honors thesis advisor. And then she got a job teaching in Japan for, I can't remember if it was 2 years or 3 years. But she was very, very excited about going to Japan to teach because she loves Japanese culture. She was learning Japanese language and was looking forward to teaching. So she moves to Japan, and of course, there was that culture shock when she got there. Although she was still excited about it, you know, there was more of a struggle than she anticipated. Things were more different than she had anticipated, and she had some adjusting to do. But then she gradually did begin to adjust to this new environment and was happy there. So now we're at the center of the W. Then after her time there, after her 2 or 3 years in Japan, she came back to the US and she went through the whole process over again. She had great anticipation about coming back to the US. She was excited to see family and friends. But then when you get here, when you get back home, again, you go through a little bit of a culture shock because life doesn't stay the same. Things didn't freeze in place when she left. So some of her family members, had a different job or a different significant other than when she left. Things were a little bit different, but she adjusted to that and gradually came back up to the end of the W. I really appreciated the fact that she contacted me when she got back to the US and said, "Remember the W curve from intercultural communication? I've just gone through that." And she explained this whole process to me. And it serves as a good example for what we go through. So to return to our example of a student coming to WMU and having to adjust to being here, let's say you come here and there's a bit of a culture shock and then you adjust, but then you go home over break and you see your friends who've gone to other colleges and you see your friends who haven't gone to college and you see family members who have had life changes in your absence. And you realize that life did not stay frozen in time while you were gone. So you have another period of adjustment to go through. And then there's the critical approach. And as always, the critical approach is going to look at power issues, in this case, acceptance versus non-acceptance by the host culture. A critical scholar is going to look at what are the institutionalized structures that make it difficult for a newcomer to adapt to the host culture. When we look at the Lost Boys, we can see that not only were they dealing with being in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar behaviors, but they were also dealing with being Black in America, which brought its own set of complications to them that they might not have expected. So the critical scholar would focus on things like that, like what were the structural inequities that might have contributed to their difficulties. When you look at the young man who wanted to be a doctor, and you think about, well, he didn't have access to medical schooling because he didn't have the money, and he didn't have, we don't know if he had a high school diploma or a bachelor's degree, but he didn't have the credentials to probably enter medical school here. He might not have known how to go about it. So all of those things were kind of working against him. Whereas if you look at Abraham, the young man who was a minister, he had a huge system of social support behind him through the church denomination he belonged to. And he was able to complete a college degree and find employment because he did have that positive structure behind him. So the critical scholar is going to look at that and say, no, these two young men did not experience this in the same way. And here are some of the structural reasons why that happened. Liminality, we're defining as a state of being in between, a state of not belonging in either place, a feeling of not fully belonging in either situation. This can be very stressful mentally and emotionally for some people, but it's a state of being kind of floating between two realities and not being fully part of either one of them. And that is Chapter 8 on understanding cultural transitions. As always, please read the chapter carefully, take good notes, contact your instructors with any questions, and we will see you in the next one.